Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with others because I have a great guest coming on. You know, obviously, technology plays a huge role in our life, and we are undergoing a revolution in this country and in the global community of sorts, particularly with AI. That's why I want to talk to Jacob Ward, who is the author of The Loop, How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. You can find links to the book on the PAS Report website, so go there to check it out. Jacob, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could come on. Now, in your book, you talk about this loop. So can you explain what you mean by the loop to the audience so they have a clear understanding?
Sure. So basically, the way that I am thinking about AI these days is as a kind of perfect way of taking advantage of how our brains work. And the loop that I'm trying to describe is basically the distinction between our instincts and who we end up being kind of without meaning to. So in our case, we're really just talking about the loop that takes place where our ancient primitive decision-making circuitry, which science has shown us over the last 50 years is really in charge, gets taken advantage of by modern patterns. And we've already seen this where people, become addicted to cigarettes, or we've certainly seen it in the social media world that we wind up making, looking at things and taking interest in things that if you were to ask us in a survey, hey, are you interested in this kind of thing? You'd say, no, I don't want to hear about that. But it's just the way that our brains have been designed, designed is the wrong word, but, the way our brains have evolved and the ways in which our modern political and business landscape have taken advantage of it. And in the future, the thing that I'm worried about in this book and that I try to spend so much time trying to explain is a world in which you're going to have these AI-based systems that are going to be able to predict the patterns in our behavior very, very clearly, because the last 50 years of behavioral science have shown us that we are really predictable. And that kind of predictability, I think, is going to create a landscape in which companies, because they can't help but try to make money off us, are going to more and more play on our vulnerabilities in the same way that the social media era did, except this time it's going to be way more precise, way more tailored, until all of us are, I think, living in a little bubble of manipulation that I worry is going to be the end of our ability to make good decisions for ourselves.
I think you bring up an important point. As someone who teaches world politics and American government, I constantly tell my students, throughout history, borders have changed, countries have risen, they've fallen, wars have begun, they've ended. But the one constant is human behavior. And now you have this technology out there that actually can manipulate our behavior, change our behaviors. One thing I'm seeing in the education system, AI does provide a lot of benefits. I mean, it really can be helpful and useful, and I try and explain that to students. But at the same time, I've had to go back to in-person writing assignments because what I find is students are now outsourcing their education to AI. It's not that they're using AI to help them, sift through legislation and find its true purpose and meaning. They're using AI to actually think for them. Mm-hmm. And so how dangerous is this going forward?
I think it's incredibly dangerous. I think, I've heard from educators all over the country that this has been true. People are sort of abandoning homework now. And we could have a good faith disagreement about whether or not homework was ever a good thing. But there was the critical thinking that it made possible or was supposed to make possible is the problem, right? I was just talking to a professor the other day who, like you, has been experiencing his students' response to this stuff. He says his number one problem is trying to convince students that there's a difference between having read a book and having read a ChatGPT summary of that book, that there's any difference at all doesn't occur to these kids. And so that is a real issue. I think one of the things that we're bumping into right now is that as you say, these can be really helpful systems for all sorts of things. One thing that I'm using, I'm thinking a lot about right now as an example of what I worry about, is the use of these technologies of chatbots to help people in addiction recovery and in therapy. People are using that more and more because we have a real shortage of qualified therapists in this country. So unfortunately, a lot of companies are just saying, well, we can just, these systems can just stand in for therapy. And what we know from therapy is that you really need to drive people into human connection in order for them to deal with most of their problems. But if you've played with an off-the-shelf LLM, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or any of the other big models, one of the things they do all the time is they both agree with you endlessly. They're constantly agreeing with you and telling you you're right, and they're trying to keep the conversation going. So they're never saying, okay, that's enough for today. Now you should go practice these things we've discussed in the real world. They're saying, now what can I do for you? And one of the things that we're seeing as a result is the rise of AI psychosis. We're seeing ChatGPT's maker OpenAI just put out a report on Monday that says that 0.15% of their users are having very deep emotional feelings, excessive emotional feelings about the chatbots. Some of them are exhibiting signs of psychosis. Some of them are exhibiting signs, in some cases, of suicidal ideation. And that 0.15% sounds like a very small number, but you got to consider this is 800 million weekly users of the chatbot. That means that anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million people using this thing each week are having big psychotic responses to being with these chatbots. And so I think students and young people and all of us are subject, are really prone to believing these systems are somehow something they aren't, and in a way falling into a kind of attachment pattern with these systems that I think can be really dangerous in the future, to the point where you may have kids no longer with the impulse to go talk to another human about their problems, or even to form an emotional attachment to other humans. I think that's really going to be a huge problem if that comes to pass.
Something I've noticed is how like you said, it wants to keep the conversation going. And so it always asks a question at the end of the prompt to get you to type more, to stay on longer. And when we examine the idea of AI, we saw throughout the coronavirus that social isolation has disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is we're animals. We need to interact with other human beings. And one of the things that concerns me is looking, particularly amongst young people, where we have a mental health crisis. Over 50% of young people between the ages of 18 to 29 suffer from depression and anxiety, there's social ineptitude going on. And I think this was a study in Britain. It showed that 82% of British young people lack any sense of purpose in life. Now, I'd like to see a study like that done here, because I think the number would be similar. When you have these AI systems going, how much worse can the problem get?
Well, I mean, one huge issue that I think we're going to see around purpose, which I think you're absolutely correct to bring up. I think it's one of the biggest, issues is
we all need a sense of purpose.
We need
a
sense of purpose, right?
Us.
That's right. It's not just the paycheck you go to the job for. It's part of, your identity and your motivation to get out of bed every morning, right? Well, what's going to happen when your first and second level, your entry level and that just past entry level kind of job in the knowledge work economy, that first clerical gig you get, that first bookkeeping kind of gig you get, when people suddenly aren't hiring for those jobs anymore, when it's time, when people are not going to do that at all. I think this is going to be especially a problem for young women. I think non-college educated women, I've seen already a bunch of big studies that show that, non-college educated women, some of their best paths forward into a really good, stable living are jobs like an admin assistant, a clerical work, bookkeeping, right? Those jobs can take you all the way into retirement and be a good life without a college education. Well, those jobs are about to get wiped out by this kind of thing. And so I think you're going to have a whole, the worry is that there's going to be a whole generation of people who not only have trouble entering the workforce, but like you say, just don't have a strong sense of purpose. And you combine that with the temptation to just spend all day at home in conversation with this system, and I think you're going to have a really tough time for that generation. One of the things, going back to this thought about addiction and therapy, one of the things they say in AA, I'm a recovering drinker, in AA they say the opposite of addiction is connection. right? Such an important thing to be connected with other human beings. And yet, I think between the job situation and this AI psychosis problem, it's just going to be, I think, a huge issue if we wind up in that case. And history, as you know, right, is full of cases where when young people are isolated, purposeless, and lonely, a lot of bad things come out of that. We saw that in the rise of fascism. We've seen that in the rise over and over again throughout history of really bad situations. When young people aren't finding their way, then things really can go wrong.
You're making me think of my grandmother, the idle hands on a devil's playground.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. And the devil could be very, very busy in the coming years.
Well, we need to take a quick commercial break, but I want to talk about the impact on the job market when we get back. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you ready to move easily and independently without pain and stiffness holding you back? Do you want to look in the mirror and see a hydrated glow instead of more fine lines and wrinkles? Well, discover Native Path Collagen, made with only type 1 and 3 collagen fibers. These are the two most important types that make up 90% of the collagen found in your cartilage, bones, skin, hair, nails, and gut. They provide maximum benefits, and Native Path Collagen is a single ingredient formula with no fillers, additives, or artificial sweeteners. Plus, it's third-party tested for heavy metals, ensuring purity and safety. Completely flavorless, Native Path Collagen can be added to anything: coffee, smoothies, oatmeal, you name it. It doesn't clump, it absorbs fast thanks to its peptide formula. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals at a fraction of the price of other brands. With over 4 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, 8,000 5-star reviews, and a 365-day no-risk guarantee, Native Path is a brand you could trust. They offer an 800 number for any questions you may have, and then you'll speak to a real person who's there to help. Visit getnativepath.com/PAS and start your transformation today. That's getnativepath.com/PAS. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm talking to Jacob Ward, author of The Loop, How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. So, Jacob, before the break, we were talking about the impact on the job market. Just this week, Amazon announced that it's getting rid of nearly 30,000 employees because a lot has to do that these jobs are no longer necessary, that we're seeing better employees through AI models who don't talk back, who don't show up late, who don't look at their phones every 10 minutes. And let's face it, this is going to have a big impact on white-collar jobs. It's not necessarily the blue-collar manual labor jobs. It's the white-collar jobs that are going to be impacted the most. And it's particularly at a time where we look at how much student debt we have. It's almost like the perfect storm. Do you think that Congress is not talking enough about the impact of AI in the job market, is not taking it seriously, and doesn't fully understand the ramifications of what's about to happen in the next 10 years?
I think that's absolutely correct. And it's not necessarily their fault. I think they have been sold the same bill of goods that a lot of us have.
And also half them are 80 years old that they have no idea how the technology works.
There's some older folks, right? I think back to this episode when Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, he went to testify before Congress early on in the release of ChatGPT, and right before the night before he spoke to Congress, he invited about 60 senators to a dinner in which he did a private demo for them of what ChatGPT could do. And those senators came out of that reporting that they were just dazzled. What an amazing thing this thing is, And I remember thinking that at that time, boy, that is a problem, because these are, this is showing people how fast this car can drive without, understanding just how dangerous this car can be. And, I think that, like everybody, these senators have been told again and again and again by this industry, there's going to be a huge benefit down the road for adopting this stuff that's going to be worth a lot of short-term discomfort. And we've heard this is a really interesting industry in that it's it doesn't do the typical thing of saying everything's going to be fine. It's weirdly able to say out loud, we're about to cause a huge amount of trouble in the world, basically. You have Sam Altman and the others basically saying we're going to have huge job displacement, our product is going to displace huge numbers of jobs. Our product is going to give rise to huge numbers of scams. But down the road, they say, it's going to be worth it because we will, Sam Altman's line is basically to say there will be enormous short-term job displacement, but in the end, everyone will be so much richer it won't matter, is essentially what he says. And so if you're a senator, I'm sure you're being sold that bill of goods and thinking, okay, this is worth it. And you're also besieged every day by the idea that we somehow in the United States can't fall behind China or fall behind other countries when it comes to AI development. So that jingoistic sort of competitive pressure plus this sort of faith-based argument that in the future there will be this utopia and it's worth the short-term harms that this stuff is going to do, I think it's probably pretty difficult to then step back and say, wait a minute, what is this for? And if my constituents lose all their entry-level jobs, then what good is any of this in the future? So I would just remind people, like, there isn't really much evidence that this stuff is in the long term going to have that utopian effect. That is entirely an imaginary argument. We do know, so these 30,000 corporate jobs that were cut at Amazon, right? That's a big deal for those folks. I would also say it's not just going to be working, white collar jobs. Amazon, the New York Times just turned up a bunch of internal documents at Amazon that show that they plan to cut about 500,000 of their 1.2 million jobs. And that includes all these people who work in these warehouses. I think you should just remember that, this is the cheapest. Knowledge work is the cheap thing to knock off right now. Not that cheap. The AI is expensive to run, but compared to paying ChatGPT to do that clerical work is cheaper. Well, when robots can do a thing more cheaply, then they're going to have them cut your hair and do the plumbing, right? We're not there yet, and I
don't need them to cut my hair.
No, I know. Yeah, you're good. You're good. You're going to make it. You're AI proof. I can see. But in the future, I think we just have to remember that we're going to automate. They're going to automate everything they possibly can, unless Congress steps in and says, we're going to protect some things. And we've seen examples in other countries of people protecting what's important. So India, for instance, has banned self-driving vehicles. I live in the Bay Area of California, where there's self-driving cars all over the place. In India, those are illegal. And that's because a huge number of people make their living as a driver in India. And the Indian government recognizes if all these people go out of work, we're going to be in huge trouble. India also has a huge trouble in terms of the number of call centers and knowledge workers and outsourced workers that work there. Those folks are all under threat from AI. So that's a country that's actually specifically saying we're not going to let certain technology take root here just because we need to protect the economic safety of our people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if disruption really fully kicks in, when people's lives are disrupted like that, when they can't find and earn a living, when they don't have a sense of purpose, that's when civil unrest can certainly ferment itself. And we've seen governments toppled because of it. But one of my concerns, it's why I started the podcast, is the government abuses of power that I've seen over the last several decades, how our government has expanded dramatically, how it uses technology to censor Americans, target Americans. We've seen it done repeatedly, regardless of political party. You have reported on how persuasive technologies can be leveraged behind the scenes to increase government power and how these technologies can easily be abused. So while we see the trouble that's going to happen in the business markets, in the employment fields, what about government and government power and how governments will likely expand with this technology?
Well, I think that, we have the capacity to use, government use of this stuff is where I really see most clearly the distinction between how well this stuff could serve our interests as humans and as citizens and how dangerous it could be on the other hand. And one country that I really take a very big interest in because they have done such an interesting job with this stuff is Estonia. So I have a podcast called The Rip Current, and I interviewed the president of Estonia recently there, and he's very interesting to talk to about how he became president just shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, and Estonia became its own democratic nation again, left the Soviet Union, and he was part of this basically overnight effort to digitize how services work in Estonia. They needed a way to try and sprint forward into the modern economy and be part of the EU. And so I
don't think most Americans know how technologically advanced Estonia is. Most
it's
Americans
incredible.
Don't even know where Estonia is.
Right.
On the map.
It's got the word stone in it. And so I think we're used to thinking, it must be a Stone Age place. No, Estonia is an incredibly sophisticated society because that's a country where you can pay your taxes in under 90 seconds on your phone. You can, any dealings you need to do with the government can happen on your phone. And that is an incredible achievement. It makes everything, they don't line up at the DMV. They don't have to hire an H&R Block to do their taxes. Everything is digitized in this incredibly beautiful way. But of course, right, the danger in that situation is that you create a surveillance apparatus that if the wrong person came into power, then you'd be in a real trouble. But what they did was they saw in advance that that was a possibility. So they created what the president of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, told me is he thinks of as a Christmas tree system, where each part of your digital life is a different ornament hanging on the tree. Here's your health care, here's your police record, here's your banking history. And each of those ornaments you can access no problem, but none of them can talk to one another. So the police can't check your bank records and your health insurer can't see your criminal record. And as a result, they've created this separated out system that allows them to do all kinds of amazing stuff, like say, hey, you you need this kind of help, and we can offer you that kind of help in advance of you even realizing you need it, without creating a surveillance apparatus. Well, here in the United States, we've seen over and over again, and whether it's the NSA, listening in on American communications for national security reasons, or something even more authoritarian, then a system like that would make it really, really easy to do that. And so it is a thing where the convenience that you can imagine somebody at the Department of Homeland Security being pitched in a sales meeting winds up being a really scary thing for civil rights in this country. And so I do worry about it.
I mean, I have to. So we look at the Department of Homeland Security. If I look at Jen Easterly, she's the former CISA director. She wanted to take cognitive functions and declare them critical infrastructure protection as part of the critical infrastructure protection plan. And that's terrifying. I mean, even down to the disinformation governance board that the last administration wanted to create. So we see how this technology can be used, and we know as governments expand, liberty does contract. So, Jacob, in your book, you talk about fighting back against this revolution, the technological revolution we're seeing, to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of becoming just simply distracted and obedient towards these systems and the people in power and whatnot. What can people do to fight back?
So, I take a real comfort from the way, you and I have been talking a little bit about how, discouraging it can be to see how students are engaging with this stuff. But I will say I am also encouraged by some of the cultural stuff I'm seeing in young people when it comes to AI. So one term that I've just bumped into recently that I really like a lot, young people have a term that's a derogatory term for AI and for older people who use too much AI, that they say clanker. They call them a clanker. If you're a clanker, then you're using AI too much, basically. Don't be a clanker. And, to my mind, there's something wonderful that symbolizes about how young people, I think, can see that this is creating a sort of an over-reliance that's just not cool and that we shouldn't be doing. And I think that I think there's going to be a generation or so from now, a generation of kids who looks at our use of phones and then AI the way that you and I look at like our grandparents smoking cigarettes at the dinner table. It's just something so so dated to have thought that was an okay thing to do. So I take some comfort from how young people are thinking about this, and I'm trying to lean toward that. But I think the short-term fighting back is really going to happen in the courts. And this is where I'll be curious, Nick, whether you and I sort of see eye to eye on this, or because I think sorting this stuff out is going to be a really important part of how, as a society, we figure this out. In this country, we are very good at regulating, I would argue, two things. One is death, and the other is financial loss, right? We do money and death pretty well when it comes to the rules in this country. You die on, people are unsafe on a roller coaster, we get rid of that pretty quick. You lose money in a scam, we prosecute that person pretty quickly. But what we have got to start looking at is whether or not we as a society want to start passing some new laws and some new rules that safeguard our right to make our own choices, right? And in that case, there's going to have to be some definition as a society about what we consider someone who's in charge of their choices and someone who's being manipulated. Because I think we're going to see a greater and greater and greater kind of manipulation out there. I'll give you an example of this. So one is, I cover a lot in the book of the example of something called social casino gambling. These are online simulators of gambling games, your blackjack, your roulette. And they charge money to play, but they don't give you the opportunity to win any real money back. It is the definition of a loser's game. And yet, this is an industry that makes millions and millions of dollars off people, typically by finding older, lonely, elderly, typically women, that they can get addicted to playing this kind of online casino simulator. Now, I look at that and I see, I've talked to women who've been ensnared by this, and these are women who've never gambled before in their lives, who, if you ask them, do you like gambling? They'd say, no, gambling has ruined other family members. I would never gamble, but they've been grabbed by this, I would argue, very predatory marketing system and ensnared in this kind of addictive behavior. Now, we look at that and I think that's wrong and that needs to be changed. But there's nothing truly illegal about that in the United States. It is okay to do that. I mean, we're a country that has legalized gambling on your phone in, more than half of the states, right? We believe that human beings get to make their own choices. It's a really important part of the American idea, is that we are our own independent actors. But with the last 20 years of reporting, right, my career has taught me, is we're not as in control of ourselves as we think we are. And huge amounts of power and money are created in this country by taking advantage of our idea that we're in charge of ourselves. So I think we're going to need to start suing on the basis of losing our agency, losing our ability to make good choices for ourselves. But that's, of course, going to get into a question that I think has really divided a lot of Americans, which is, does someone who is making choices own those choices? Or should you blame, a manipulative ecosystem for having twisted their decision-making? And I think we're not good at that conversation yet. That's a new conversation in this country.
Well, I don't know how new it is. I mean, if we look at the tobacco companies, listen, people made the choice to smoke, but at the same time, the tobacco companies were held responsible because they were lying to the public for so long. And I think the same holds true with tech. And another point of optimism is the Supreme Court, regardless of political leanings or political ideology, has consistently ruled in favor of liberty than, government abuses. And what I mean by that is, you look at Justice Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, two people who couldn't be even more different political when it comes to ideology, but they ruled together when it came to things like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and all that. Where it creates questions is when the Supreme Court and the courts lambast federal agencies and departments for abusing their power, and there's no enforcement mechanism,
Sure.
so that they just get ignored. So it's going to be a wild ride for the next decade. That much I could say.
I really do. And I think your point about cigarettes is a really good one, because, right, people back then, you could say to them, well, do you like smoking? And they'd say, man, I love smoking, right? I was a smoker once upon a time. I loved smoking, right? The feeling of being this is the challenge that we're going to face, I think, is that the feeling of being manipulated by these systems isn't going to be one that you say, oh, this is bad, I don't want this. It's going to feel pretty good. That's the whole point of manipulation. It feels good to be manipulated in that way. But what made the difference, as you point out, is the internal documents that we saw at these cigarette companies. Next year, we're going to see a bunch of lawsuits against social media companies that are going to finally reach court. I think the discovery process there is going to show us these are companies that really know us in a really fundamental way. And this is going to be true of the AI companies too, which are using that same data, that social media data. So I think the more that we see how these companies make choices, the more we're going to have legal footing to try and push back against it. I think that's going to be our best hope going forward.
It's a great point. Jacob, I really appreciate you coming on. Everyone needs to check out The Loop, how technology is creating a world without choices and how to fight back. Great conversation, Jacob.
Professor Giordano, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.